Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I am doing my second book review. If you missed the first one, it was of How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent by Julia Alvarez. Today I'm reviewing her second novel called In the Time of the Butterflies. As I mentioned in the last one, I was really excited to read this book and learn more about Dominican history, especially the Trujillo reign and era. I did feel like this book gave me a good look into that history. So today I am going to be overlapping a little bit with my last book review. So if you want to go ahead and check that one out before you watch this one, you can, but I don't think it'll really matter if you watch them out of order. But I will be talking about some similarities between the two novels. Without further ado, let's just jump right into this book review. I'll be talking about my first reactions to the book, a little bit of a summary, and then some favorite quotes of mine from the book, and some discussion questions at the end. Feel free to subscribe if you want more book reviews like this, or if you have book recommendations. I love reading books from Dominican authors because I live in the Dominican Republic. That's what inspired me to read Julia Alvarez's novels. I already said let's begin, so let's actually begin now. Let me give a short little summary of the book. I'm just going to read the back of the book. Unfortunately, today I did not have the book with me because I had to return to the library, which is in the US, and I already came back to DR. So anyways, we are just going to read it off of Amazon. It says, "It is November 25th, 1960, and three beautiful sisters have been found near their wrecked Jeep at the bottom of a 150-foot cliff on the north coast of the Dominican Republic. The official state newspaper reports their deaths as accidental. It does not mention that a fourth sister lives, nor does it explain that the sisters were among the leading opponents of General Rafael Leonidas Trujillo's dictatorship. It doesn't have to. Everybody knows of las mariposas, the butterflies. In this extraordinary novel, the voices of all four sisters, Minerva, Patria, Maria Teresa, and the survivor, Dede, speak across the decades to tell their own stories, from secret crushes to gun running, and to describe the everyday horrors of life under Trujillo's rule. Through the art and magic of Julia Alvarez's imagination, the martyr butterflies live again in this novel of courage and love and the human costs of political oppression." So that sort of gives you an overview of the book. My first reaction when I was reading the first couple pages was, wait a second, is this a series? Because both of the books start out in the same setting. There's a Dominican woman who's from the US, so she lived in the US for a long time despite being Dominican, and she's coming back to the DR and she's driving around sort of lost. Both of them start out with these very similar situations. So I was like, wait a second, is this supposed to be the character from the other book? But throughout the whole book, this character that we start with doesn't really get named besides her being some sort of journalist. I'm not sure if she's meant to be the author, Julia Alvarez, or what, but she doesn't really get a name. The book isn't exactly about her. We just use her as a probe to ask questions and dive into the story of the main narrator. So that was my first reaction. Now I want to give some similarities between this book and her first novel. They're very different, but they are kind of set in similar times. The first thing that was similar was that they all go backwards in time. This one does move forward chronologically once you're in the story, but there are moments when you're back hearing from Dede, the surviving sister, in the moment in 1994, telling the story, remembering in history. So they do kind of have this reverse order going on, but it's not as much in this novel as it was in How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent. Second, both of them are families with four sisters. One, they were just leaving, they escaped to the US from the Trujillo reign, and in this one, they stayed in the DR. So it gives sort of a flip view what one family did moving to the US and then what the other one experienced staying. The third similarity is that it shifts perspective, so each chapter is from a different perspective. In How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent, that one often had a group of characters for each chapter, but this one focused more on one sister each chapter, even though it did talk about the lives of the other ones. Since they all live close, they were sisters, they share their experiences. The fourth similarity is that it focuses more on one sister than the others. And this one more naturally does that because the character that I mentioned in the beginning goes to Dede, the surviving sister, to hear her story, to hear her version of the events. So naturally it'll go back in time to her, and then she'll reflect on things, and then she'll start telling the story again. But the book is from a second-person omniscient narrator who can tell us about all the sisters without it being from Dede's voice. And the fifth similarity, kind of relating to it being in reverse chronological order, is that the ending is known. In How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent, it's not known before the book starts, but once you read the first chapter, you see where the sisters are at now in their lives, and then it takes you back in time and fills in the blanks. In this one, you know how the story ends, which I kind of liked in some ways because I didn't have to get so heartbroken towards the end, but you know that the three sisters end up dying tragically, and then you go back and fill in the blanks of what their lives were like. Some of my reactions to the book were that it was really shocking to hear about the things Trujillo did. I mean, I didn't really know that much about that era of Dominican history before reading the book, so I did appreciate this book as a way to learn more about it, to learn what it was like for normal everyday people. I mean, in some ways you would say the mariposas were normal everyday people. They were some of the people on the front lines fighting against him. But I did enjoy this, and I would recommend this book for anyone who wants to learn more about that period in time of Dominican history. Also, I did really like how she told the story from the viewpoints of different sisters, but also still fill in the blanks with what was happening with the other sisters. Like, one chapter would end that they were about to get married, and the next one would be like, oh, we just had her wedding. And so it would smoothly carry on the story a little bit more smoothly than in how the Garcia girls lost their accents. And when I was reading the discussion at the end, like the discussion notes, it did mention that this is not based on true events. Actually, let me read that. The author's note at the end does mention that these Mirabal sisters in this book are not the factual Mirabal sisters. They're not even the ones of legend, but they're just the ones that Julia Alvarez imagined them to be. In a way, I kind of felt let down when I read that. I wanted this to be like such a true story, this to really be their authentic experiences, but I mean, I still enjoyed it nonetheless, and I don't think it took away from my understanding of the book and how the story was told. I also wanted to say that although I mentioned that the ending did not hit as hard as if I didn't know what happened to them, for people who do know the history, I mean, it's kind of inevitable to know what happens. It's kind of like Romeo and Juliet. Everyone already knows what happens, even if they've never read or heard the play. But I will say that the ending still hit hard after she did spend this whole novel telling about their lives, their dreams, their families they're creating, and it was so sad at the ending. And then to hear how Dede, the sister who wasn't involved in his attack, how she lived on and had to tell the story for the others. Another thing I wanted to note is that I don't know if this book was originally written in Spanish, but some parts of it did seem like it was written in Spanish and then translated. Just some phrasing of things. I didn't really make a note of anything like this, but some parts it did seem a tiny bit unnatural in English, which kind of reminded me that it was written by a Spanish-speaking author. Obviously, she's fluent in English. I'm not doubting that at all. But I was kind of curious about the way some of the things were phrased. And I did not feel like I noticed many of those in How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent. Would I recommend this book to others to read? Yes, I would. What would I rate it? I think, honestly, a 9 out of 10. It was a really captivating read. It kept me going back. It also had short enough sections that I could be like, okay, let me just finish this chapter and then go do whatever responsibilities I had. And it was really good historically to learn about what it was like in that time period if you're interested in it. Even if you're not, it was a good story nonetheless. Now let me go through some of my favorite quotes in this book. The first one, when I was saying before that it reminded me of the beginning of How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accent, this is the quote from it that made me think that. It said, Gringa Dominicana in a rented car with a road map asking for street names. She is originally from here but has lived many years in the States, for which she is sorry her Spanish is not so good. So that was like, wait a second, that reminds me of Yolanda in the other book who was speaking English to the people in the Colmado instead of Spanish, even though she's Dominican. So it reminded me of the other beginning. And then my next favorite quote, when she was trying to arrange a time to meet with Dede, and said, oh yes, the gringos need a time, but there isn't a clock time for this kind of just right moment. That was on page 4, which is funny because it's true. In America, we always need a time for things. We want to schedule things. I'm like that. I'm like, okay, what time are you going to be here? When is this going to happen? What time does it start? But in the DR, it's just like, okay, they come, they do this at whatever time it happens. If it's late, it's late. It doesn't really matter. Time is just like a different concept here. And on page 10 was kind of when I got my first taste of what it was like living in the Trujillo era. And the family is talking, but they're outside. Basically, the one sister is really passionate about wanting to go to law school and becoming an influential person in politics. And the father says, you and Trujillo, Papa says, a little loudly. And in this clear, peaceful night, they all fall silent. Suddenly, the dark fills with spies who are paid to hear things and report them down to security. Don Enrique claims Trujillo needs help in running this country. Don Enrique's daughter says it's about time women took over the government. Words repeated and distorted, words recreated by those who might bear them a grudge, words stitched to words until they are the winding sheet the family will be buried in when their bodies are found dumped in a ditch, their tongues cut off for speaking too much. That was a little bit of foreshadowing there. and it was a little bit of a shock to read that so early on, but it also gave you a taste of what was to come. Next favorite quote was on page 11. It said, "I don't know who talked Papa into sending us away to school. It seems like it would have taken the same angel who announced to Mary she was pregnant with God and got her to be glad about it." That was funny to me. Basically, their dad was really stubborn, didn't want the girls to move far from home, but somehow they convinced him. Next one is just a funny quote, I think by Maria Teresa, the youngest sister. It was on page 31. It says, "I have been practicing walking up and down the stations of the cross with a blessed look on my face. Not an easy thing when you're trying to keep your balance. I think saints all lived before high heels were invented." And then I kind of did with my last one too. I didn't find another quote that I wanted to write down until it was later in the book. I also just got wrapped up in reading it and I started reading it really fast. So the next quote was on page 214. It says, "Don Bernardo really was our next-door angel disguised as an old Spaniard with an ailing wife. He had come to the island under a refugee program Trujillo had instituted in the 40s to whiten the race. He had not been much help to the dictator in that regard, since he and Doña Belén had never had any children." This was interesting because I have heard that phrase before, whiten the race. I didn't know this was an actual thing that the dictator wanted to do and brought in people from like Spain and Europe, which is interesting. And now I can see maybe there's still some of that trickles into the society today because I literally heard someone say that in my presence. Anyways, I won't go into that today, but let's go to the next quote on page 247. This is another moment. In the last video, there was one where there was a moment from a perspective of an American who said the Dominicans pronounce something a certain way. And this was sort of like a click moment. I was like, oh, that's why it's written like that. I said, "That's why we nicknamed him Santa Claus, after the big jolly American saint who brings gifts even to those who don't believe in a Jesus or the Three Kings." I was like, oh, Santa Claus. I was like reading that. I was like, okay. And then I realized, oh, Santa Claus. On the next page, 248, another one of my favorites was, this was a connection moment. I was like, wait a second. Isn't that the family from how the Garcia girls lost their accent? Like the De La Torres? It said, "When Magdalena was 13, her mother died and she didn't have any place to go, so she took a job as a maid for a rich, important family, the De La Torres. Real snobs." I was like, wait a second, is that the same family from the other book? Because I'm pretty sure it was the De La Torres girls, even though it's Garcia girls. My mom's last name was De La Torres. Let's move on to the next book. Right now, this is in the epilogue. The book ends, like, it stays from the perspective of the three girls who get attacked and murdered, right up until it happened, essentially. And then the epilogue starts after that with Dede's perspective. On page 318, this is one of the girls' former husbands talking to Dede in some sort of gathering where people are reflecting on the past. He says, "The nightmare is over, Dede. Look at what the girls have done." He gestured expansively. He means the free elections, bad presidents now put in power properly, not by army tanks. He means our country beginning to prosper, free zones going up everywhere, the coast a clutter of clubs and resorts. We are now the playground of the Caribbean, where once just killing fields. The cemetery is beginning to flower. I thought that was a beautiful quote to end the book on a good note. Like, the sister didn't believe that the girls really did anything by their death, and it is hard to see why did they have to die for this cause, but in the end, things did begin to look up. The dictator got assassinated, and there's a lot of things that happened, as mentioned in that quote, a few different observations she had. Now, let me talk about some of the discussion questions. I just want to talk about this question where it says, what does it mean to write historical fiction? Did it bother you that the sisters Alvarez created might not be exact duplicates of the historical Mirabals? Dede has said, when asked about specific details, that some of them Alvarez invented or learned from somewhere else. But she loved the novel because Alvarez, quote, captured the spirit and personalities of my sisters. Does the book encourage you to want to know more about them? I would say yes, it does encourage me to want to learn more about the sisters. But I did like that discussion question because it mentioned that Dede had read the book, or at least acknowledged that some of the details were invented, but then some of them were learned from some other sources who maybe knew about their lives. Another thing that was interesting about the book is that the day these sisters were attacked and murdered, the United Nations has declared November 25th, the day of the Mirabals' murder, the first day of the international movement, 16 days of activism against gender violence, which ends on Human Rights Day, December 10th. So that was really cool that they made that whole day based on these Dominican sisters, and I never knew that. So my camera keeps dying, so I'm going to wrap up this video. I do recommend this book. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye!